Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching India's World with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj on Friday said that the leaders who termed China's blocking of banning JEM chief Masood Azhar at the UN a diplomatic failure must see that India was alone when the move was first made in 2009 under the UPA rule, while it has worldwide support in 2019. Her remarks came a day after Congress President Rahul Gandhi hit out at Prime Minister Narendra Modi over China's blocking of the UN resolution to designate Azhar a global terrorist, alleging that the PM was weak and scared of Chinese President Xi Jinping. Sushma Swaraj asserted that India has secured unprecedented support from the international community for listing the Jaish-e-Mohammed chief under the UN Sanctions Committee. On Wednesday, China for the fourth time blocked the bid in the UN Security Council to designate the chief of the Pakistan-based terror group as a global terrorist by putting a technical hold on the proposal. The Chinese move was termed disappointing by India. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze how the world stands with India against terrorism. Joining me on the program today are Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs and Distinguished Fellow, Observer Research Foundation. Jaidev Ranade, former Additional Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat and Security and Intelligence Expert. Swaran Singh, Professor, School of International Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. First, let's try and put into perspective and try and understand why the bid was rejected, or why did China throw the spanner in the works?
Well, I think it was entirely expected because China cannot dump Pakistan. The relationship has become so close and tight. And China also has other factors in mind, like buying peace with some of the terror groups, its own investments, growing investments in Balochistan where Chinese workers have faced attacks, etc. But I think more than that, I think is also the fact that Pakistan came under a fair amount of international pressure this time. So they are really trying to save a client state. So that is the main purpose, because Pakistan's use of terror as state policy is mainly directed towards India and Afghanistan. And also Iran, I would add Iran there also. And so China is a low-cost option for China to keep India engaged with Pakistan on the terror issue, whereas it does billions of dollars of business with India at the same time. So China basically is kind of balancing its relationship with Pakistan and India. And the Chinese ambassador, for example, has now suddenly tweeted, or I think said that, oh, we will sort this out very soon, etc., and all these things. So I think China is playing a double game. Its double speak on diplomacy is very well known. I think we are all aware of it. So it's playing a game of its own. And I think if you want to complicate the issue even further, you have to throw in Afghanistan as to what is happening there, the talks with the Taliban, etc. And the last point is that China itself is a little vulnerable in Xinjiang because of the Uyghurs, their Muslim population. We have all heard that over 1 million Uyghurs are in detention camps, or what China calls re-education camps, etc. So it has that factor also to contend with. So, and it has succeeded to some extent because Pakistan, the great champion of Islam, is absolutely quiet, mum. And so is the OIC and other countries, except for, I think, Turkey, which has made some noise on this issue. It's a kind of, there's not a squeak from the Islamic countries.
Right. Mr. Ranade, because the reasons stated by the ambassador, is this something that will come back and haunt the Chinese later on? Because China has got, immense stake in Pakistan because of CPEC, and we all know what Obor means for Xi Jinping. So, not acting against someone like Masood Azhar, is this something that could probably cost China later on?
Well, I'd like to add a couple of things also, that I quite agree that China decided that it needs to shelter its near vassal state, which is Pakistan at the moment, and therefore exercise its so-called technical hold, or continue a de facto veto, I would call it. But in the process, what it has done is it has highlighted the manner in which it makes a distinction between the people who are responsible for terrorism inside China and others. So the double speak which he spoke about comes out very clearly here. The same old story about, your terrorist and my terrorist. So I think that's one. The second, I think, and if we look into it a bit deeper, is China's interest with Pakistan. They converge on Kashmir. And I think the two of them have been plugging the same point. China, particularly since April 2015, has been asking us to ease tensions with Pakistan and resolve the Kashmir issue. Of course, when they say resolve it, it means on Pakistan's terms. So that is the second factor. About this action of China's coming back to haunt it, I think they have got the situation in Xinjiang fairly solidly under control for the present. It may erupt later.
But what about CPEC and Pakistan?
That is a worry for them. The worry is that if we decide to escalate the confrontation with Pakistan, then the CPEC project will also be in danger. In fact, you would recall that Balakot is just about 35 kilometers from one of their projects. So they are, I think, concerned about it. But they feel that through this method, they're exerting enough pressure on us or signaling to us that they don't want us to really, escalate the issue and that they're backing Pakistan. I should also mention here that their vice foreign minister went to Pakistan, days before this UN Sanctions Committee met. And obviously there they would have discussed it. But he also at that time spoke and gave a reassurance to Pakistan about safeguarding its territorial integrity, etc. So I think China is playing a game where it wants to continue to keep us under pressure and also, as I said, shelter its vassal state. I don't think it's going to come back to haunt them right now unless fundamentalism grows in the Central Asian republics and other places and, the Uyghurs get much more active than they are at the moment.
Right. Professor, that having been said, post-Wuhan, we saw a change in relationship between India and China. Now that China has used its veto power for the fourth time as far as Masood Azhar is concerned, is it time for us to have a relook at the Wuhan warmth?
I want to first put it in perspective. I think we are perhaps laying too much weight to this one episode. One, this is only part of a whole process. So one could go back as far as 1996 when India proposed the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism at United Nations. So it's part of that larger process of building global consensus in favor of India's view on how to counter terrorism. And from 2009, of course, specifically in dealing with Azhar Masood in this case. So it's part of a process. We now know that almost 3 definitely very clearly, veto holding powers are in favor of declaring him as a global terrorist. So sometime building that process of a kind of a pro-India opinion at global level perhaps suits us and brings us greater benefit than the outcome of having this individual declared as a global terrorist.
And an individual who is ailing and probably might not be there for a long time.
Ailing or not ailing, see, like Hafiz Saeed, this man again will continue to be under protective detention, which they are telling is an arrest. So I don't think on the ground declaring him global terrorist will enormously change problems for India or in terms of relationship of India and Pakistan. Second important thing that we must underline is that this is only one component, one issue on a whole range of issues that India and China are engaging between two countries. So I would say, yes, we have to be really careful in how to further calibrate our policies to either incentivize. After all, Chinese should see something positive for them in giving in this, the way they look at it as a concession to India, or continue isolating Chinese. And we have seen repeatedly examples of India's waiver at NSG or exception given at IAEA is very clear. Chinese finally give in when they see that costs are really rising in taking such a position as in this case of Azhar Masood declared as a global terrorist. So I think we have seen their track record. If we continue to push and see that, for example, attack in New Zealand just now, again is generating global impression that a rising power, emerging power like China has to behave better than this. So sometimes developing global opinion which are in favor of India perhaps that process is far more benefiting than the outcome that might be one individual being declared as a global terrorist to nothing changing on the ground at all.
Sure. Ambassador, your thoughts on recalibrating ties with China? Is it time that we have a relook?
Well, calibrating ties is a continuous process when within the government and within the Ministry of External Affairs. Of course, we will need to calibrate, but how much to calibrate, etc., that will go on. One point we must not forget is that the UN system that was trying to put this Masood Azhar on the list, etc., would have not really given us any great advantage on the ground. Of course, it would have again shown that Pakistan in bad light, that it is again harboring another terrorist. Pakistan already has to live down its image of having hosted Osama bin Laden. Then, of course, the other, the LET head,
Hafiz Saeed.
What's his name?
Hafiz Saeed.
Hafiz Saeed is also loafing around there, doing whatever he wants. But they actually downgraded LET as the proxy against India after 9/11. So they are now trying to get LET mainstreamed as a political party. So they are relying more on the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the JEM and Masood Azhar for the attacks on India. So I think they are also changing their game plan a bit. But in the end, I think the facts on the ground, because as long as China keeps protecting Pakistan, I don't think Pakistan was going to give up this proxy tool that they have against India, because it gives them an asymmetrical sort of an advantage, because we don't use terrorists, they do. And it also gives them a balance which they feel that in the conventional domain, which it gives them an advantage. But this time, of course, since India attacked the Balakot camp, we basically raised the stakes for Pakistan, saying that, look, we can do this, and if you again do this kind of a thing, if you don't roll back this, there could be other consequences, similar consequences, and that could go into the maritime domain also. The Indian Navy is currently, I believe, fully deployed off the coast of, not very far from the Chinese coast. Now, Pakistan coast,
close to Gujarat.
Now, if anything happens in that domain, the maritime domain, which is of course away from the land frontiers, etc., China will stand to lose a lot. For example, let me, be a little sort of bold and say that if something happens in the maritime domain, Gwadar is going to be hit, Karachi is going to be hit, all the ports, I'm saying. When you have that kind of a thing, it can lead to that also. So I think ultimately China also stands to lose if there is open confrontation and war. So the Chinese will have to again, weigh all these things. And the Chinese ambassador's words that indicates that they are probably going to revisit this issue. At least he's trying to say that. I don't know what the Chinese are actually
going to do, but at least for the time
because they are masters of doublespeak.
Right. Mr. Ronare, that having been said, and taking the point that the ambassador just made forward, clearly there's a two-pronged approach as far as Pakistan is concerned, trying to legitimize Hafiz Saeed and the LET and using an organization like the JEM headed by Masood Azhar against India. So in a situation like this, should India be more proactive and go after these terror elements, or rely on international support at international forums really, or fora, to try and get that support and then use that as a pressure point against China and Pakistan? What should our strategy be?
I think we are already doing both. And as far as India is concerned, my sense is that we understand that we must continue to apply pressure on Pakistan. And the diplomatic route is one route. But at the same time, I think the surgical strikes and Balakot have both not only escalated the situation, but brought direct pressure to bear on the terrorist outfits operating inside Pakistan, with the blessings and the support of the Pakistani establishment. The army and the ISI are one and the same entity. Many ISI officers go on to become army chief in Pakistan. I think the civil government is as much hand in glove with them as otherwise. So I think with this Balakot strike, India has indicated that it is going to go after the terrorists. So I think it's put on notice Pakistan and to an extent China. And therefore, I come to your second point about recalibrating the relationship which you mentioned. I think that is a continuous process and it's already underway. And in the case of China, we have seen it happen in Doklam and post-Doklam. I'm purposely not alluding to Wuhan. That was a case of bringing down temperatures in my view. But even now, it's a question of putting pressure. And here I would say that we need to continue to put pressure on both, on Pakistan, of course, and the terrorist groups, and on China. And hopefully, after the Palakot strikes, these Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar will be very careful about how they function and where they get together, because another strike could well come their way. So I think there is that recalibration is taking place on a broad-based level, and I expect that it should continue.
All right. Professor, now going back to a point that you were making and the kind of support India has received right from the late 90s to now 2019, what has led to this support that India has received?
I think it's definitely raises India's visibility, India's credibility, India's influence in global discourses on terrorism. The most latest is the conversation that Indian Foreign Minister had with the French Foreign Minister, L'Adrien. And France has already said we are imposing freeze on financial assets and travel, which means they are at least as a nation declaring this man, Masood Azhar, as a global terrorist. So I think that process is showing that India is incrementally making progress in pushing that agenda forward. An example of, for example, OIC, where again Indian Foreign Minister addressed the plenary and Pakistan was absent. So there's a whole lot of larger canvas where India is playing, and simultaneously, of course, upping the ante in terms of airstrikes on Pakistan, engaging the Chinese. We should also appreciate they have incrementally also moved forward from the standard line from, eliminating terrorism of all kinds in all manifestations. They moved a step forward in the Russia, China, India triangular meeting, saying breeding grounds. And that has a clear connotation. Where are the breeding grounds? Should not be used for political and geopolitical goals. And second line saying international cooperation in terms of state agencies must coordinate to eliminate the breeding grounds. So we should notice a little bit of inching forward by the Chinese and look at Chinese compulsions. This is going to come up again in 6 months. This issue is not dying. I mean, this proposal will come back again for discussion. Will Chinese continue to stand against the wall in that sense? And moreover, they are going to be holding the presidency of a financial task force in October. There is an anticipation, the very fact that Chinese were given vice presidency in understanding with India and United States that they will not loosen the noose on the Pakistanis, and therefore the Pakistan country has stayed on the grey list. They could be moving to the blacklist soon. So I think Chinese will also have to deal with several pressure points and hurdles as they move forward, both in terms of mechanisms at international level, their stature in the global sort of landscape in terms of rising power, bilaterally between India and China. So I think there are multiple pressure points which will push Chinese gradually to accept this one proposal. But we must also underline the fact that this is not the only issue that decides the equation between China and India. There is so much more. And I think therefore this should be put in context, and it would possibly, one could even insinuate before end of this year you will have him declared as a global terrorist. Whether he's dead or alive at that time, we don't know.
Right. Ambassador, that having been said, terror, we all know, is a global problem. It's a problem that the world is facing, and everyone's trying to come together as one and deal with this problem called terrorism. And the fact that India has raised this at several summits over the last few years, is that working in our favor, where the world is looking at us as someone who can tackle terrorism effectively?
I think the world is now far more aware of the menace of terrorism than before. Yet, of course, the UN still cannot agree on a definition of terrorism, etc. But be that as it may, it doesn't really matter. But I think individually nations are worried about terrorism. India has been a victim of terrorism. And that is why you see a narrative in Pakistan also, that we are also a victim of terrorism. Now, who created that terrorism? Then they point to the Afghan jihad and all those things, what Al-Qaeda establishment and all that. So they have their own narrative on terrorism, that we are also the question of being a victim for Pakistan is part of the narrative. Yet they also are using terrorism as proxy against India, Afghanistan, Iran, etc. So I think Pakistan's, this dual kind of a policy has to be curbed. This tendency to use terrorism. China would be an important player in that, and one of the ways of putting the pressure on Pakistan, they have actually come under a lot of pressure. Even the OIC, where they had a free run against India all these years, for all these years, they found that they could do nothing. They threatened to boycott. They couldn't muster that strength or the support in the OIC itself, which means that the OIC, their own Islamic countries and brethren, are worried about Pakistan. That what Pakistan is doing is not that they are not going to support Pakistan in this terrorism business. So, and FATF, of course, will be the crunch time, really. Now, would China sacrifice Pakistan's interest in favor of its interest? Obviously, if China feels that way, it will sacrifice Pakistan's interest. And if Pakistan is put on the blacklist, it will mean huge problems for the Pakistan's economy, its ability to raise loans, and then the IMF loan is also pending. So all these things are pending. They are hanging like a Damocles sword on the head of Pakistan, and it is up to now Pakistan's policy makers to decide. They will probably do some tactical, backing down, in my view, because I think it is the terrorism is so deeply now embedded in the Pakistan's army doctrine as to how it will deal with India, which is the enemy for them for all practical purposes. So, how it acts now. So I feel that they will pull back till all these issues are sorted out, and then they will go back to business.
All right. Mr. Ranade, how does India, use this goodwill and this support, use it as a leverage going forward? What's the best way forward, really?
Well, I think we need to continue it, and we have got a lot of goodwill that's demonstrated at the latest Sanctions Committee, where really no one opposed the proposal. I think, furthermore, France has decided that it will take it up with the EU and move a similar thing there. So we have a lot of goodwill going. I think that was demonstrated, if I may just take a step back, during the NSG proposals also, to get us admission to the NSG, where again China was the holdout. So there has been, but I think another factor that really played a role was our decision to carry out the airstrike at Balakot. And I think that is when the countries realized that India is now willing to, as they say, put its money where its mouth is and take action on its own to sort out the problem. And I think it would have been appreciated that the strike was not aimed at economic, military or civilian targets, but instead it was focused only on the terror targets. So you remember that not a single government, not a single intelligence agency has criticized the action or doubted it. So I think it was a success, and together they would have seen India behaving responsibility. But I think, as far as China is concerned, certainly we need to indicate to the Chinese that there is a cost, that we are very serious. And I think there are a couple of things that we can indicate to them straight away, where, for example, the rollout of the 5G by Huawei. I think that is something is in any case a threat to our national security. That's something we should stop straight away. It will pinch China at this particular point in time and make them pause and think. There are other steps also that we can take. And as far as the Chinese ambassador's statement is concerned, I don't give it too much weight. I think it is because he has seen the extent of unhappiness in India, and he's trying to diffuse that to some extent. That is how I look at it.
Right. Professor, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Several interesting things, actually. The mechanisms are moving in their own sort of pace. In February, there was this meeting of Financial Action Task Force. Before this meeting, Pakistan was in grey list, was supposed to do 5 actions. After that meeting, now it has to do 27 actions. So the nose is tightening gradually on Pakistan to be more responsive to what it has to do. Second, We have lately, for about a decade, seen Russia drifting towards China and Pakistan. Now, this whole process is bringing Russia back to India's fold. They have to take a stance. They have to take a position on where they stand on this. And if they stand with India, it automatically means they don't stand with Pakistan. Third, Chinese thought they will do some kind of a deal with India. And Indian government has clarified that there is no chance of any deal on this. And I think indication was that they are holding next month the second Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. India is the largest economy in the neighborhood. It will be seen as clearly conspicuous by its absence. So I think in that gradual incremental process, I see this having come about to a great advantage of India rather than disadvantage to India. I mean, we are suffering on the ground, there's no doubt about it. Each life is important. But if you look at how India has emerged at the global scene and the whole discourse is moving in favor of India, I think there are a lot of advantages that are accruing from this whole process, the way we are conducting ourselves at international platforms.
Right. All right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. And you can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.